The Yakuza series has always had memorable villains. With the first few mainlines, we would see fan favorites like Nishiki, Ryuji, and Mine make their entrance. Even outside of endgame bosses, the likes of Someya, Kuze, and Watase have consistently been praised. For the most part, they all had clear ideals, ambitions, and a beautiful portrayal of the two via compelling gameplay. And yet, amongst these great portrayals, there were some figures throughout the series that simply raised question marks before and after the fights we would have with them. For example, someone like Hangman in Yakuza 6. For now, I would like to shine the light on a slightly less abstract example of character writing. Today, I'll be talking about the final boss of Kurohyou 2, who despite his vivid characterization still has an undeniable mystique to his person. That man's name is Nozaki Rio. For those less familiar with Kurohyou, you probably know Rio as the guy with one of the best boss themes in the franchise, that being the classic Born to be Wild. But that is just the explosive finish to this character's compelling actions. We're talking about a villain who, for most of the story, we're led to believe is essentially a demigod. We see him use literal mind control, correctly prophesize major events in the story, and have attacks that send out actual shockwaves, in a time well before the over-the-top attack animations of Yakuza 7. And while the story of Kurohyou 2 does recontextualize some of these mysterious actions, more specifically Ryo's prophecies, so much of what he did is just beyond explaining through logic alone. You could of course chalk it up to inconsistent character writing, but considering this series' deep connection to concepts like faith, destiny, and fighting against the path you're meant to follow, it's more intriguing to delve deeper into the actual character and see the truth for ourselves. Since most of the Western fanbase hasn't played the Kurohyou games, I'll give you some context for the second game's story. Naturally, this video will contain massive spoilers, so if you'd like to experience the story for yourself, check out the fan translation by Team K4L right before this. The protagonist of the story, Ukiyo Tatsuya, returns to Kamurocho after spending some time abroad. He finds out that a place close to his heart is in danger of being destroyed. That place is the underground arena called Dragonheat. Throughout the first game, we've seen Tatsuya grow from being an irresponsible, violent kid to being someone who'd risk his life to protect the people dear to him, the same people he himself used to reject for so long due to abandonment issues. He developed his own fighting philosophy and became a beam of hope for all fighters who entered Dragonheat to prove their own ideologies to the world. Every single fight in that arena led to Tatsuya's further and further mental growth. Now, due to an internal struggle within the Tojo clan, Dragonheat itself is close to being turned into a shallow cash grab, where lunatics would fight to the death. In order to prevent that, Tatsuya helps the Kuki family, who owned the arena when he himself fought there, and shared his goal of keeping this place pure and genuine. A rival family in the Tojo clan decided to involve an outsider to help them claim ownership of the arena, and that outsider was the Ashura. Normally, you would be right to write off the Ashura as just another street gang, like the color gangs in Yakuza 1. But this group's actions went far beyond simple acts of vandalism. The Ashura was involved with everything from gun violence to human trafficking to housing professional assassins to help further their agenda. The acts we witness throughout the game make the Ashura seem far more intimidating than most of the Yakuza families we see in the mainline entries. It makes you wonder what kind of lunatic would be in charge of such a violent group. To no one's surprise, Nozaki Rio is the one pulling the strings and causing chaos all throughout Osaka and Tokyo. But why? What makes a person fall that far off the deep end? Well, take a look at this. Here, we see a shy little orphan who loves reading and spends all of his time with a girl his age. For the longest time, this was all that mattered to Rio. That was all he knew and all he cherished. The friendship he had with the girl slowly grew into a loving relationship as well. They were genuinely happy. As they grew up, the living conditions from the time in the orphanage kept taking their toll on the couple's health, and Ryo's girlfriend, named Shizuka, had to be hospitalized on numerous occasions. The only way she could recover from her illness was a liver transplant. Throughout the Yakuza series, we've seen just how far people can go out of desperation and what they do to protect a family member or a loved one. To ensure that Shizuka would get her chance to live a normal life, Rio did countless unspeakable actions. It was the only way that an orphan like him could earn so much money in such a short time. Despite all odds, Rio collected the money needed, and Shizuka would finally have her surgery. And then this happened. Rio overheard a conversation between the doctor and an unknown man. The doctor was bribed to switch out the names of 2 patients on the waiting list. Soon enough, Shizuka passed away. Everything that the 2 of them sacrificed to live a normal life was in vain. Rio was suddenly doubting his entire existence. Through the countless books that he'd read, he learned to trust in concepts like faith and destiny. With his background in fortune-telling and the knowledge he amassed, he believed that it was up to him alone to save his love. Yet, the only thing waiting for him was the realization that the world just wasn't fair. That the same faith he'd trusted in for so long had forsaken them both. After Shizuka's death, Ryo abandoned his beliefs. He essentially traversed the same path as Virgil from the Devil May Cry series. He would seek power in order to never feel so helpless again. And in this world, money and status were everything, so he'd have to attain them by any means necessary. With everything I've just told you, it's easy to see why people would sympathize with him. The man was blind for most of his life, had just lost the only person he cared for, and was led to believe that the foundation of his very life until now was worthless. The first time you actually see him in the game, which is completely optional, is by visiting the doctor's office in the Ashura building. You can approach him, but he won't say a word, he won't even turn to your direction. He reminded me a lot of Walter Sullivan from Silent Hill 4 when I first met him. He acted like an insignificant NPC, whom you'd never assume to be a threat. The first real conversation Ryo has with Tatsuya, he offers to give him free medical treatment, despite the fact that Ryo was now employed as the Ashura's personal doctor. He didn't try to harm Tatsuya in any way, as he just wanted to help someone who was injured. It didn't matter that this person was technically allied against him. Couple that with the amount of care Ryo has shown to his girlfriend, and you'll realize that he's no lunatic like his underlings. Despite the Ashura's insane actions, Ryo by comparison was calm and logical. Coupling that with his, at times, supernatural abilities makes for a bizarre character, but you'll notice that his portrayal thus far wasn't that of a villain. For most of the story, we're led to believe that a completely different character is the leader of the Ashura. And that's what makes Ryo so terrifying in hindsight. He is that well hidden. He has been there for every key event in the story, spewing doubt into Tatsuya by warning him of the events that would follow if Tatsuya kept fighting the Ashura. For the most part, it wasn't a villain's threat. It was a complicated ally showing genuine concern for the protagonist. He even reminded me of Majima at times. So, what is it that makes Nozaki Rio such an outstanding villain? To put it lightly, it was everything he managed to hide for this long. To Ryo, everything was disposable, including the very Ashura whom he'd raised into an army. They were a simple tool for him to reach his end goals. And what were those end goals? Obtaining power and getting revenge. The latter objective would showcase his cunningness due to the person with whom he needed to ally himself. The chaos propagated by the Ashura was used to help a corrupt politician acquire some land. That politician was the governor of Tokyo. The governor, named Tsurumi, wanted to, in his own words, cleanse this cesspool of a city, referring to the Kamurocho district in particular. In doing so, he managed to do something that no other villain in the series could do. Do you remember the scene with Tachibana in Yakuza 0? During the economic bubble, all of the money he earned allowed him to extinguish all of the light in Kamurocho. That action only lasted for a couple of seconds, in a time of true economic prosperity. Imagine how much wealth and power you would need to do that in 2012. Tsurumi did that. For most of Chapter 9, all of Kamurocho is drenched in darkness. The streets are lined with a private police force beating down anyone who disapproved of the new order. Furthermore, Tsurumi himself was to blame for Ryo's girlfriend's death. He bribed the doctor so that his son would get a liver transplant instead of Shizuka. If Ryo wanted to have his revenge, he'd have to take down a man whose wealth and influence were genuinely unrivaled. We've seen firsthand what power the police and lower government officials had throughout the mainline Yakuza games, even when compared to the country's biggest crime syndicates. It is no stretch to say that Ryo was put in the same position as Kiryu at the end of Yakuza 6, and if someone with the mental fortitude and experience of the Dragon of Dojima can waver in their beliefs when faced with that kind of pressure, then that same stress would instantly crush anyone else who would face it. And Ryo knows this. It's one of the reasons why he wasn't even sure if avenging Shizuka was the right thing to do. But he kept going, to obtain the power he'd needed to take down even someone of Tsurumi's stature. He needed to work for the person who took his life away from him. To call Rio like an Ashura at this point would be an understatement, as he quite literally is an Ashura. By definition, Ashuras are demigods of war. They are beings who were once forced into a situation where the only way out was an endless war, where only the relentless and inhumane could survive. To reach this end goal, Rio had to manipulate an army of fighters into creating a large enough crime syndicate just so they could serve as hired guns for the governor to use behind the scenes. All of the chaos that came from it was trivial. The lives threatened and lost were a stepping stone for Rio to get close enough to Tsurumi and earn his trust, also that he could utterly shatter him. And this is where his villainy truly shows. Towards the end of the game, Rio manipulated Tsurumi's own son into taking his father's life as they stared each other down. Tsurumi would meet his end at the hands of someone who was the exact same as the people he wanted to cleanse from Kamurocho. Just a spoiled brat led by his own vices, a greedy shell of a human. Rio masterfully manipulated countless people to reach this point and give his enemy one of the most painful ways to go. For someone who used to be so kind to go this far, you would have to lose everything. And to Rio, his girlfriend and the fate he had to forsake were everything. Tsurumi's death would be the end of this relentless war that he was forced to fight. But much like his entire journey thus far, the ending wouldn't be so easy to achieve. One man stopped in to stop any further bloodshed, and that was Ukiyo Tatsuya. With every fight we went through in Kurohyou 2, Tatsuya's beliefs didn't waver. Despite losing a close friend to Tsurumi, he still couldn't bring himself to kill that man. The desperation he was facing wouldn't break him. To Rio, this act was maybe even more daunting than losing his girlfriend. Both he and Tatsuya were orphans. They both grew up in poverty, they lost the ones they cared for, and could barely fight back. When Rio was faced with this dilemma, he went against everything he stood for. Meanwhile, when Tatsuya was faced with this turmoil, his resolve only strengthened. Because of the bonds he developed through Dragon Heat, he could walk the higher road. And despite knowing Ryo's involvement in everything that happened, he still tried to help him. The fight that ensued afterwards would be Ryo's final test. Was he right to abandon his faith, or could he have changed everything with enough resolve? The ending of the fight was as beautiful as it was tragic. Despite Ryo's violent actions, you soon realized that there was still a part of his kinder self left beneath. He set up numerous cameras all along Millennium Tower to televise Tsurumi's confession to all of the crimes he'd committed, as a failsafe if his prediction didn't come true. And despite the fact that Tatsuya prevented Tsurumi's actual murder, the governor's life would still be over, just as Ryo foretold. Tsurumi would be nothing in the eyes of the public without his influence. Yet, with this conclusion, Rio was finally shown that almost everything he'd done up to now was pointless, which only reaffirmed his latent doubts. At the start of his journey, he lost the love of his life, and by the end of it, he lost himself as well. Along the story, he would use the influence of the Ashura, as well as his cold reading skills, to make any divination he would come up with a reality. There was nothing supernatural about it. It was just the money, the power that Rio seeked out, making these things a reality. And yet, in spite all of that, Tatsuya was the one person who could never change his ways. He was the very manifestation of Ryo's beliefs before his girlfriend's death, and the fact that his actions made Rio realize the errors of his ways was the final wake-up call. In the end, the revenge that Rio seeked out was a goal he would have achieved just as fine if he hadn't abandoned his beliefs. And so, after protecting Tatsuya from being shot, Rio mournfully said his last words to him, and by proxy, his old self.
どれだけ道にそれても
やめろー！
いつだって変えられるんだ運命は。ちょっと忘れちゃってただけさ。
I hope that by the end of this video, you will see Nozaki as more than just a cool boss fight from some Japanese spin-off. His actions in Kurohyou 2 were a genuine joy to behold, and because of that, I hope that more of the fanbase will remember him just as fondly as they would the other fan-favorite bosses. He truly deserves it. With that, I would like to conclude today's video. This will also be the final release made to celebrate the 10-year anniversary of Kurohyou 2, so we'll see what other topics I can present on the channel in the months to come. I hope you'll stick around for that. Anyway, that's all for today. Take care of yourselves and have a great day. Cheers!